got a loud voice. We'll just go with that while we're working out our technology. Kia ora everyone, my name is Donna Brown and I am the Head of Counselling at Howick College. It is an absolute delight to welcome you to our school tonight. I've been actually talking to Dr Kristen Davis, Kirsten, for about a year about wanting to hold this event. And the reason is that in our school, and I know that it's the same in our neighbouring schools, we're having a real emergence of young people coming up and say to us, I'm having these really big emotions. It's overwhelming and I don't know what to do with it. And our statistics about our young people thinking about anxiety is skyrocketing. And so is the phone calls that I take every day from parents saying, what can I do? So this is why we've come together and we've put on this event so that we can support our parents, to support our children, to know how to have these conversations and hopefully come away with some really great ideas and strategies about what you can do and what's available in our community. So I really am very proud to be presenting tonight. We've got Dr Kristen Davis. I don't know, do you want to do a tag down?
Yeah.
And Leigh McCabe
Don't show me
from
up,
the
I haven't got
psychology
one.
group. They've put together a fantastic presentation and I ask you just on a little bit of housekeeping, in case there is a fire alarm, and I'm sure there won't be, but if there is, can you make your way out through these two side doors and into the front car park? Bathrooms are located just out here to the left, and now I'll leave it over to our amazing hosts. And if we can put our hands together and give them a great thank you and welcome. Hopefully the microphone works for you. Okay.
All right, I just got to check I'm working. Am I all good? Yeah, awesome. I'd actually really like to open with a karakia, if possible. E noi tātou. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E he aki ana te atukura he teo, he hoka he hauhunga, tihei mauri ora. Ko pāniko te maunga, ko taitaia te awa, ko maraitai te moana, ko te wairoa te kura, ko Viv toku mama, ko John toku papa, ko Kirsten toku ingoa, ko ngai tai te iwi rohi. Kia ora, my name's Kirsten. We'll just introduce ourselves quickly and try not to feed back off each other. It's actually really exciting to be here. I did a talk quite a while ago in Clevedon at the local church. I'm a local mum and some of you, or there's actually lots of you in the community in the audience here. I've got people from my antenatal class, I've got people from my Cook's Beach camping crew, people that I've just been to Rarotonga with, so that's really exciting. So I've lived and grown up in this community, actually grew up in Bucklands Beach, went to Maclean's, and now I've landed and live out in Clevedon. I've got two kiddies, a 12-year-old boy Xavier and a 9-year-old going on 16. We're going to talk lots about our children's experiences and different things as we go along, but they're both at Clevedon Primary. So part of my passion is not just about being on the ground and doing the mahi and really working alongside our young people in our community, but it's also about how do we actually increase access to the knowledge that we have, given the fact that actually so many of our young people are struggling at the moment. I'm a clinical psychologist by trade, have done that for 20 plus years now, and worked in all sorts of settings actually, community mental health, oranga tamariki, lots of different places and spaces. Am very, very privileged, and Trudy and Kylie are here tonight, us three ladies forging our way in the business world at the psychology group, and so we're a very small growing business, but part of what we're super passionate about is actually our local community, given that we're all local Howick girls, and some of you will know them too. And that's why it's exciting also to have Leigh here with us as well, who is also a local mum, and she'll introduce herself as well. But yeah, we've got a wonderful team, so I'll let you introduce yourself.
Awesome. Oh, I am on. Kia ora koutou, ko Leigh McCabe toku ingoa. It's so awesome to be here tonight in Howick College, and we really appreciate you coming out to join us. I've worked with Kirsten and the girls for almost 3 years. I'm an occupational therapist and I have a postgrad diploma in cognitive behavioural therapy. Prior to working at the psychology group, I worked at County's Manukau DHB in mental health and addiction services, and also at the Auckland Spinal Rehab Unit. So I feel like I've been around. I know a few faces in the audience. Thank you for coming. I grew up in the area, went to school in the area, and now live in the area with my husband, 4 teenage children. In my spare time, I ride my bike. I do their laundry,
Mum stuff.
So here we are. Yeah.
Awesome. And thanks, Donna, and for Howick for providing this. It's really awesome and really, really appreciate it, because I think it's pretty hard sometimes to get spaces to do the things we want to do. But anyway, let's crack on. All right. So in the session today, we're going to do a few different things. We're going to move between the two of us in terms of presenting some of the different things we're going to talk about. I think overwhelmingly one of the things we've observed, and all of you in this room have probably observed, is that actually the impact of COVID on our young people and our whānau has actually been quite significant. But in saying that, actually, in the last 10 years, there's been a noticeable increase in anxiety and experiences of anxiety with young people. So this is not necessarily a new thing. The other thing we know about anxiety is that we often inherit anxiety through a long line of worriers. So I often say to my mum, my mum's a worrier, I'm a worrier, Milan's definitely a worrier, that actually sometimes worry is something that actually in some ways we have to normalise and understand, is that actually sometimes the way that our personalities are, we have increased sensitivity sometimes, and we lean towards the direction of worrying about things more than not. So the other cool thing actually tonight is there's heaps of dads in the audience. This is exciting. The last one I went to, I think I had about 160 women and 10 men. So actually this is, I really think it's awesome actually. Because one of the challenges I think sometimes as parents, particularly with children that have lots of worries, is how do you get on the same page when you parent them? Because often what happens is, in my house anyway, I have one quite strong, lay the hammer down kind of parent, and despite the fact that I'm the psychologist in the room, I tend to be the one that kind of will give in a little bit more. And so it's quite hard when I talk about these children as super sensors. Sometimes when you've got a child that's particularly sensitive to emotion, it can be quite difficult to know how do you get on the same page. And sometimes that shows up in places like trying to get them to school in the morning. I mean, Mondayitis is pretty kind of typical for lots of young people, and one of the challenges that we've seen a lot is actually children attending school post some of the lockdowns, particularly in Auckland, that actually they've struggled to get back into kind of the swing of things. My understanding from most of the schools in the area, that hasn't been as much of a problem as some other schools in our community, but yeah. So do you worry about bad things happening? These are some of the questions that often, one of the things we'll talk a little bit today is about how do you have conversations around this stuff. We will sometimes notice that our kids are worrying more than normal, but actually how do you start to think about and have conversations about worry and figuring out at what point does worry turn into actually anxiety and a problem that actually maybe needs more help. And so I think that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, is that continuum, that actually here we might worry about day-to-day things, but it doesn't necessarily impact our life. But actually over here we might actually start to have things where we start to avoid situations, we don't want to go out socially, we say no to lots of things. So as I talk through, and Leigh and I talk through this stuff, the reality is this is all about, this is for you guys as well. So this is not just actually about come here for your young people, that actually many of the things we talk about today will be strategies and things that will be helpful for most of you in the room who also sometimes experience worry. And so, we'll talk about that. So some of the typical things and patterns that we see, particularly with people that worry a lot, or young people that worry a lot, they tend to have this kind of worst case scenario way of seeing the world. They sometimes worry about bad things happening, which is particularly noticeable, obviously, since COVID's occurred, where in reality bad things have been happening. That kind of inability for thoughts to kind of slow, like that constant thinking. So another telltale sign often is struggling to go to sleep at night, waking up during the night or waking up early, and just not being able to kind of switch off that kind of speaking that kind of happens in your head. The other thing is that sometimes it's hard for us as individuals or our young people to actually talk about what goes on in their heads, right? So what you might see is more a presentation that happens in their body. So for many in the audience who know my daughter, she's this kind of wild, red-haired young lady. And when she was about 5, she kind of rolls into the house and she spread eagles and lies on my bed, and she's just like, oh, my tummy's so angry. And she's crying and and I was just like, oh. And my husband was like, ooh, which he tends to do a lot actually. He's like, I'm not sure what to do with that. That's your job. So I actually pick her up. I mean, you guys know her. Pick her up and I walk her down to the kitchen and I like put some food in her mouth and she was just like, oh. And she's like, oh, I just needed to eat. And so in that moment, what I was trying to figure out was these physical symptoms and what was going on. Was that about how she was feeling or was it she was hungry? In fact, it turns out she does have that thing called hunger and actually it's a thing. Then not long after, probably about a couple of months later, same thing kind of happened, although she was, not lying on the bed, but the same thing happened and she was overwhelmed and, my tummy's so sore and I can't, it's angry, I'm so angry, and actually tried to feed her, that didn't work. But actually when I kind of knuckled down and actually sat and talked to her, something had happened that day at school. And so what was happening there is her body was telling her in the way that it does sometimes with worry, that actually I'm worried about something and something's going on. And the thing we're going to talk about today, and Leigh's going to touch on this, is that we all have the signature of emotion. Like we all experience anxiety sometimes in different ways. So for her, and for me actually, a sore tummy is something that I notice. I don't feel sick or nauseous, I get a sore tummy. So what the challenge is as a parent is, as you grow a child, how do you help them learn about emotions and their emotional experience in a way that's normalizing? I'm not like, oh, you're worrying, like you need to sort that out or you need to not worry. Like we've got to find a way to kind of breed these beautiful humans so that they know what their experience of emotion is. Because what we know, hands down, with all of the research, is that if you can observe and understand and name the emotion you're feeling, you're halfway there to actually figuring out what to do about it. So lots of life changes obviously occurring in recent times for many, many people. And that often you'll see young people potentially that from the time they literally come out, they are sensitive and reactive perhaps to situations. They might not want to go to kindy. They might, have some separation challenges where they don't want to leave you. So some young people you'll observe a pattern of sensitivity from early on, but other young people will be absolute happy-go-lucky for quite some time, and something will happen in their life and things will change. And so that's why life changes are quite important to observe and think about. So here's the thing about fear. Fear is there to protect us. Like if you think about back in the olden days when you got a saber-toothed tiger running at you, what are you going to do? Huh? Run? Anyone going to punch it in the face? What are you going to do? Grab it. So the thing is, fear is instinctive to us, and we're going to talk a bit about this soon, but it's a survival instinct. And so when we think about worry and growing young people that experience worry, it is super important. It tells us super important things. It drives us to kind of either we fight back or we avoid or run or flee. It's there for a purpose. And so worry is something that actually, for many people, worrying in and of itself is a way of kind of trying to solve a problem. Sometimes when we think over and over something, as long as it's not for like 5 hours, it is actually about a way of really thinking through and finding a way to kind of solve. By the way, too, if people want copies of these slides, we can send them to you. You can leave your names at the beginning. So worry tends to be short-lived. One of the things we know about emotions is they only last 40 to 60 seconds. That is actually how long an emotion lasts in your body. That's how long it fires. But what keeps it going is the next thought you have, paying attention to physical sensations, the fact that you're breathing fast. And so the experience of anxiety itself is not harmful, although it is unpleasant. So many of you will have had experiences in your life of kind of that a level of stress is functional and makes sense. Now, for any of you that are in term 3 and have got teenagers starting to kind of get to that point of like needing to study for exams, a little bit of stress is kind of helpful. If they're like, oh yeah, it's going to be fine, probably not much study is going to happen, right? So we all know that there is a certain level of stress, and we'll talk about this a bit later, where actually it motivates us and gets us to perform or engage in the things that we need to do. And so that's why too much stress is overwhelming. And so many people definitely at this time of the year will notice potentially a crash and burning because people feel sort of overwhelmed with what's going on. So there's lots of theories in terms of the research around what causes anxiety. We've already talked a little bit about adjustment after life stresses. Sometimes we've got a predisposition, a genetic predisposition, which is why I like to talk about this kind of long line of worriers. Now that might be either there's a genetic leaning towards the fact that you are sensitive to things in the world. The other thing could be that sometimes if you've got a parent or you parent in a way that's overprotective. Now some of you in the room might have had a parent like this. That's very overprotective, that doesn't let you take any risks, that's like, oh, don't do that, don't do that. That can also instill sometimes worry in young people. It stops them from sort of stepping out of their comfort zone. And it's totally understandable often because there's reasons why as a parent sometimes you overprotect, but that can also lead to it. And that's what we mean by this idea of helicopter parenting. Who here has a phobia of something? Spiders, cockroaches, put your hand up. Who's got a phobia? Yeah, a whole bunch of you. Do your children have the same phobia? Some of you? Yeah. So interestingly enough, I learnt this early on because I don't really love spiders. I can tolerate them, but I really noticed this at, like probably with my daughter. I mean, my son was lying in bed last night. He's like, oh, there's a spider. And like it makes you think sometimes, because if you're really fearful of something and you talk about it and they see that, sometimes they develop that fear also. Now that's usually not a bad thing because most of the time phobias are pretty common about things and we don't tend to worry so much. But so learning theories is an important way of thinking about how is it that my young person has developed anxiety, what's occurred in their life for them to learn that being in this place or space is a dangerous place. So social anxiety is a really common one where what you tend to see potentially is a trigger or a series of triggers. It could be bullying, it could be standing up in front of the class saying a speech and people laugh, or it could be a sequence of events that might lead them to start to go, actually speaking is a problem for me, or I'm afraid to do that because if I do that then people will laugh at me or people will say things. And so what you sometimes see is a pattern of avoidance start to develop, where they start to avoid situations. And what happens when you avoid is that your anxiety goes down in that moment because you're out of the game. We've got a cycle picture to show you soon. But what it means longer term is that you then don't learn to master and be in that situation and be able to cope. So some of these beliefs we've tipped our hat to a little bit already. One of the things we sometimes see is what we would call an overestimation of the probability of danger or something bad happening. And so you'll have your young person talk about, oh no, it's going to be terrible, everyone in the class is going to laugh at me. Whereas you probably know in your heart of hearts that that's actually unlikely to happen, but in their minds it's like that's exactly what's going to happen, right? And so that's quite a common pattern of what we would see. One of the other things we're seeing a lot and growing more and more is OCD, obsessive compulsive behaviour, which is repetitive checking, or there's lots of different ways that OCD presents itself. It might be repetitive checking, it might be hand washing, particularly challenging post-COVID given it's a germ pandemic. And so again, it's that sort of thing of if I don't wash my hands, then something really bad's going to happen. So beliefs kind of evolve around that. Definitely an intolerance of uncertainty. Lots of us don't like uncertainty and don't like change, but what we're seeing more and more is people, and young people like grasping on wanting to know how things are going to go. And in reality, we know that there is not sometimes certainty about things, and so they won't try new things or do new things because they're afraid of the fact that they're not going to work out. Underestimating the fact that actually they probably could cope in a situation. And so I think that's something important to instill as parents as you start to kind of walk that journey if you've got a fearful child, is how do you get them to kind of enter in to situations that they're afraid of. The thing for me, so my son's got, he's 12 and he's got charge syndrome, which is quite a significant kind of disability. He rocks this world, by the way. He does whatever he can to kind of own it. But one of the things we've done from a very early age is he's got a profound level of hearing loss and he's aided and he struggles to speak clearly. And so one of the things he had from early on was a fear of actually like being in a cafe and asking for things or doing things. And what we've done from a very early age is actually getting him to keep going, keep practicing. And he's had a couple of experiences where he was in school and there was a whole row of kids that all laughed at him when he was standing up because they couldn't understand what he had to say. Now, interestingly, one of the parents at school said to me, "Why did you put him up there?" In my head, I was like, well, why wouldn't I put him up there? But that's an interesting, so for that parent, they might have been like, oh, I don't want my child to go through that. Whereas I'm like, like this. And it's still not easy. But that's a good example of where trying to help him, it is uncertain what it's going to be like for him if he gets up and speaks. And so there's a few other things, fear of safety and fear of the worst. So the thing we've got to think about is, when does fear fit the facts? So when does worry make sense? And when is it actually too big or out of proportion to the situation? And this is a really important question to kind of think about. If you've got a young person who's really worried about something, it may be that a little bit of worry makes sense. So we don't want to be like, oh, you have to be fine about everything. So we talk about how emotions fit the facts, when we think about anxiety tends to fit the facts when we are in danger or there's potentially something that could happen that we might be laughed at, for example, that there might be a risk to your life or your livelihood. And so really recent times, anxiety really has fitted the facts, actually. There's been lots of fears that people have had, and justified fears around the kind of pandemic that we've had. And particularly for our young people navigating school, are there going to be lockdowns? How do we deal with all of that? When we think about fear, and we're not going to talk much about pure fear today, but if there's a real danger and you freeze, that fits the facts, right? Because it's your body saying, danger, danger. And so some of what I need to do, often when I work with young teenage women and men, is they need to get a little more afraid of actually getting in a car with someone who's drink driving. Sometimes there's actually not enough fear in that situation. And so this talks a little bit about how emotions make sense. Sorry, I didn't have time to make it bigger, but essentially with this, what's really interesting is that if you think about what happens in a situation, if I think about, say, for example, a young person's at a party and someone's going, get in the car, and their fear or their worry is kind of like low, like down here, I actually want them to get more fearful, because I actually want them to really think, actually, oh my gosh, what's going to happen if I get in the car? And there's quite a lot of situations at the moment where we actually need to do that. And that's not that I want them to have a panic attack, but I actually need them to really listen to their intuition and the fact that actually being fearful makes sense in this situation. And there's a lot of young men that I often work with that I need to do that. It's like kind of getting them to feel a bit more worried about situations and pay attention to what's around them. The other way around is really thinking about, if the emotion's too high for that particular situation, how do we regulate emotion to a point, which we'll talk about today, where it fits the facts of a situation more. So the thing is that we're not actually trying to fix it all of the time. That's not always the goal. The goal is actually about how do you sit with the emotion but regulate it to a level where you don't fall over with panic, because that's the challenge, right? What we want to do is get people to kind of be able to regulate their level of anxiety. And so when you think about your young people, say with, fears of going to school and you're trying to get them out the door, you're not going to stop them from being anxious, getting them to school. But what you want to try and do is help them regulate their emotion to a level where they can walk through the school gate. So then they get the learning, once they're through the school gate, that maybe being at school is not so bad after all. And so this is really interesting. I mean, we could talk for days on this about how to anger and how you regulate other types of emotions. But for fear particularly, for you in your mind, when you're thinking about, your young person, it's really thinking about, how do I help them think about, okay, so let's check the facts of this situation. Like, what are you actually worrying about? How likely is it that it's going to happen? And then helping them to kind of regulate the level of worry that they feel. And we'll do some strategies around that later. Right. Leigh, over to you.
Am I on? Yep. Yeah. Well, this talk about parties and fast cars and teenagers makes me pretty nervous as a parent. And I notice that as my kids get older, my anxiety increases. I've got a 16-year-old son who recently got his learner's license, and he's been getting around Howick on a 50cc scooter. He is loving the independence. My anxiety has increased. I notice when he's late home that my breathing gets a little bit shallower. I feel a bit nauseous, my chest feels tight, and all I can focus on is his safe return. I have images perhaps of him. Well, no, let's not go there. And so, yeah, my anxiety is higher. My husband, however, appears brain dead on this issue. He thinks it's a fair and reasonable risk for my son. The difference to our response and to this, our emotional response, is our perspective and our experience that we bring to this. So I worked at the spinal unit. I see motorbikes as an ACC claim waiting to happen. He grew up on a farm and owns a motorbike, so he sees it as fair and reasonable and has a fair amount of sort of father pride that his son's on a kind of mini motorbike thing. So the reason I mention this is because in supporting our young people, it's really helpful to notice our own experience of anxiety. And like Kirsten said before, we all have a signature of anxiety. Well, there is a signature of anxiety, but we all experience it differently. And it's so good to understand our own so that, one, we can regulate our own emotions and then assist our young people with theirs. It's also really helpful to understand what the brain, and this is a vague picture of a brain, and the body does in response to emotion. One, so that we know that this is actually an automatic response that our body does, and we don't necessarily have control over it. And two, so that we can validate for our young people what that feeling is like. And actually it's really uncomfortable, the feeling of fear and anxiety. So looking at the brain up here, we've got the front up here where we have the prefrontal cortex, and part of the role of that is to assist with the regulation of emotion. In the middle of the brain, we have the amygdala, which is part of the limbic system, which its role is to perceive threat and control emotion. You can't see the brainstem, but part of the peripheral nervous system is the autonomic nervous system, which you've probably heard about. This is not meant to be a science lesson, but part of the autonomic nervous system is the part of our nervous system that regulates all of our physiological responses in our body, including heart rate, respiration rate, digestion, any of those other things that just happen kind of automatically. Actually, what I might get you to do, just for a bit of movement, put your hand up like this in a fist, actually with your thumb inside. And this is just a really nice way to remember that when our brain, when we perceive threat, and you know, actually I will let you put your hand down in a moment, but just thinking about this, in the middle is our limbic system, our amygdala. It perceives threat, and the frontal lobe does this. If I undo that. And the prefrontal cortex becomes unavailable to assist with regulation of emotion. You can put your hands down now. In the case of our young people, and I work with a lot of young people, the threat can be as simple as going into school, walking into class, answering a question in class, speaking in class, internals, externals, lots of social group pressures. Kirsten mentioned social anxiety, and that turns up so much with our young people. And social anxiety is really fueled by the fear of judgment by others. And let's face it, there is judgment. So, where was I going with that? So yeah, the amygdala perceives threat. It activates our fight or flight system. The adrenal glands secrete hormones which increase our respiration rate, increase our blood pressure, increase our breathing rate. And yeah, that's what happens. So it's really helpful to keep that in mind and understand that, because that is a very automatic process, really uncomfortable. And what happens when emotions are high like that is we become very tunnel visioned. We can't actually access very easily rational thought, our problem-solving skills, decision-making skills. And so it's very hard to reason with someone who's in a high state of anxiety. Has anyone ever tried to coax a young person into school when they're anxious? Yeah, I hear some murmurs. I had an experience myself a little while ago, which I'm a little bit embarrassed of, but I went caving with my kids' mountain biking team, and we got into the cave and it was pretty and there was glowworms, and so that was lovely, the focus. But as we got deeper into the cave, they were talking about this upcoming 20-metre squeeze. And the more I thought about the squeeze, the more I couldn't notice the glowworms, but all I could think about was Homer Simpson and how I may actually blow up and get stuck in the middle of the squeeze. And I know that's so irrational and unreasonable, but my nervous system had actually activated the fight or flight that actually I couldn't be reasoned with. And as soon as we kind of turned on our lights again, I said, I'll be leaving now, in the middle of the cave, and actually had to be escorted out of the cave because no amount of reasoning or rationalising with me was going to work in that instance. One of the things that we do in therapy, and like I said, we work with a lot of young people, is we get the opportunity to actually have a look at the thought processes with young people that fuel and maintain their anxiety. And we do that when they're not anxious and stressed, so that they have a lot more opportunity to rationalise and use more useful and balanced thoughts when anxiety turns up. The other thing that we do in therapy is we spend a lot of time practicing emotion regulation skills when they're not stressed or anxious. And it's a good thing for us to remember, I think, as parents, so that when they are stressed and anxious, they've got a lot more ability to access them and use them effectively. And we are going to be talking about some skills, hopefully, that you can have a bit of a practice and take away tonight as well. Skipping through these. So the two parts to the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, often called the fight or flight. I'm not going to do a science lesson because I think we all know about this stuff. Those are all the things that it does there. The parasympathetic nervous system has the absolute opposite function of the sympathetic nervous system. So what we're trying to do when we're trying to regulate emotion is activate both the prefrontal cortex to support the limbic system and also activate the parasympathetic nervous system. If we can understand what some of our responses, like increased breathing rate, we know that we can then activate the parasympathetic nervous system by slowing down our breathing rate. Just one thing I wanted to mention also about anxiety is these thoughts and our perspective toward it that either maintain it or help us to have a chance at managing it and regulating it. If I have the thought, oh no, this is anxiety, I can't cope, I'm overwhelmed and I'm out of control, we are going to most likely experience more anxiety. The reason that we think about this stuff is because if I can have the thought, okay, this is anxiety. Sounds almost unrealistic standing here saying this, but if we can take the position, okay, this is anxiety and my body has reacted in this way, then we've got a lot more chance of actually regulating and using some skills. So I guess just take a bit of a look at this. See what you resonate with, what your own experience is. See what your children say, what you notice in your children. Some people that we see in therapy, some young people are very fidgety. Some are definitely not fidgety, they're very closed down. So the presentation can be different, so it's really important to know your own and your children's. That's me.
Awesome. All right. So yeah, one of the really interesting things is you actually can't be in both nervous systems at the same time. And so when Leigh sort of talks about this idea of like sympathetic, parasympathetic, I mean, you don't need to remember all of that. What you tend to see if you search on the internet, actually, and there's some great videos, by the way. There's so many amazing resources, I mean, as you all probably know, but really search out for some of these ideas and concepts and ways of actually watching little snippets of videos, because there's a lot of child-friendly snippets out there. But really what we want to try to do is start to educate from quite an early age that this response, or the stress response that we have, in some ways is quite normal, but how do we get them to move from that kind of stress response, fight, flight, nervous system into rest and digest or relax response system. And so this is just really about like you guys thinking about some of the different types of situations where you potentially experience this kind of fight, flight response. And I think, and what contributes to your stress. And so the other part of some of what we're sort of doing at TPG actually is pulling together a sort of corporate program. And what's really interesting about that is starting to really explore and think about, like, for us and our experiences as parents, what are some of the things in our different jobs and places and spaces where we experience stress? Because I think one of the challenging things is if we get overwhelmed and end up coming home at the end of the day, we've got a lot less patience sometimes too for a child who's worrying a lot, or in the morning. I mean, I know myself, I'm a pretty busy lady. Most people will testament to this who live around me. But, you know, Roz is like, yeah. But actually, you know, like you wake up in the morning and you're trying to get stuff done and you've got deadlines to meet and this and that. You're going to have a lot less tolerance to actually be able to kind of sit and validate your young person's experience in that moment of how worried they are about the fact that they haven't got their spellathon words learnt yet, which is what I had this morning, you know. So I think it's really interesting. And so, you know, there's some great stuff to read, but I think some of the things at the top are things I've been thinking a lot more about lately, and I just put in here about, you know, when you're in a work situation, some of the things that contribute to your kind of own stress and work situations sometimes are things like values conflict, where your values kind of don't align with the company, work demands, insufficient rewards, where you're not sort of being rewarded enough for the work that you're doing, and, you know, there's a bunch of other things such as deadlines, things that we would expect normally. But I think the reason this is here is because one of the things we know is that actually when things are going well, we can often tolerate and cope with the ups and downs of everyday life quite well. What we know though is actually there's a lot of things that actually cause us to be more vulnerable to emotion. And so some of the therapy that we do, particularly in one of the groups that's called DBT, but we talk a lot about how to observe what our vulnerabilities are. And this is relevant for you and your children as well. You know, if you don't have such a good sleep, if it's that time of the month, if you've got a deadline coming up at work, if they've got spellathon on the horizon, you know, that all these things actually increase our vulnerability to emotion. So sometimes what's really challenging, and this is something that I'm educating my husband a lot about, for my little one actually, is that actually he's like, why is it on this day she copes fine with it, and then she's like lying on the floor crying? He's like, he can't get his head around how it is that on one day she responds to the same situation in this way, and then on the other day it's like this. And this is one of the challenges of parenting, right? And so what you've got to do is step back and go, oh, okay, has she eaten enough today? Has she done this? You know, what's happening in her world that makes her more vulnerable at the moment to emotion? And so quite a bit of work sometimes is actually thinking about what your vulnerabilities are. And whilst I know this is common sense sometimes for us as adults, that we need to try to sleep well and we need to eat regularly and, you know, get some exercise in, we don't always think about that combo with our young people so much. So, yeah. And so for you guys, when we think about it, similar to the graph before, that really what we're trying to get to is a place of optimal performance, not just for us, but for our young people. And I think about this particularly relevant to some of the teenagers currently who are, have looming exams coming up. That what we want to do is get that kind of sweet spot where they can perform at their best. You know, not to have them be so overwhelmed. I mean, I used to be notorious. I used to like study till like, I don't know, 3 a.m. in the morning. I'd like binge study. Probably not so good for, you know, the general well-being in my life. But it's thinking about, you know, how do you support when they're fairly independent actually in their learning? How do you support them to think about how to manage all those other vulnerabilities so that they have an optimal level of performance? And I think it's an ongoing challenge. And what we're seeing quite a lot and have seen with recent times, particularly with COVID times, is that a lot of them are just kind of like breaking down and just like bombing out, you know, and they just, that's it, they're so overwhelmed they just can't get their heads around studying. And that's where wonderful teams like the guidance team and stuff are able to support, hopefully. So sort of as we sort of head towards thinking about like what do we do about, you know, if we observe a pattern of worry, what do we do about it? The thing is that what we know is that there's this kind of relationship or biodirectional relationship, that if you work on relaxing and finding ways to calm your physical experience of anxiety, it's going to have a flow-on effect to you probably avoid less, and your thoughts will probably be, maybe I can stand up in front of my class and do my speech. You might lean more towards the behaviour component, which is actually one of the things we know about anxiety, is that you are not going to feel like doing things sometimes, you just have to do it. And I always like the saying, like, you got to act your way towards change. And that's actually a reality sometimes. And so you could talk to you like blue in the face about how, you know, the class is not going to laugh for you, it's going to be fine. But actually, until your young person stands up and actually speaks and looks around the room and realizes that not everyone is laughing at them, they won't have that experience of really knowing. And so being able to actually do the behaviour. And so this is quite relevant, I think, for a lot of the younger ones that are worried. When you look at, like, what are some of the typical situations you guys are dealing with at the moment that your young people are fearful of? What are some examples?
Speeches.
Yeah. Camp. Yes. Yeah. What else? Change in general. Yeah, yeah. And some young people, change is really hard, isn't it? Like, it could be little changes, like there's a reliever today, I can't go, versus, you know, bigger changes, like, you know, a change in routine, or your teacher's going away, or what have you. Yeah. What other examples people have of situations that they're facing at the moment with worries? Yeah. Yeah, so worry what other people think. So what with them, what do they avoid doing? Like, having those thoughts, like, I'm worried what people are going to think of me, what does that stop them from doing, do you think? Making new friends, yeah? Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So it's difficult, isn't it? Like, if you start with a thought up here of like, worrying about what people think, like people will think I'm a loser or what have you. If you start there, it has this effect on behaviour, which means you take less opportunities to participate. You are less likely to chat to people. You know, your fear of not making friends comes true because you don't make friends, because you don't speak to people. And so you can see this kind of pattern of how all of these things interact. And so the challenge sometimes, and this is we move towards thinking about strategies, is where do you intervene? You know, how do you support them? Because with your young person, it might be that if they had a go at going, I'm going to talk to 2 new people every week, that might actually, if you set that goal for them and you sort of put things in place to get them to kind of get there and do it, you might find they might make a friend. And so that behaviour that actually might then result in a new experience, which then means maybe I might meet people, you know? So it's really interesting, like, how you think about the way you kind of work on which bit do you kind of work on as a parent? Because actually, you know, I mean, most of what I tell my young people, they're like, you don't know, you're just my mother. So, you know, so trying to change the way they think is actually very difficult sometimes. And lots of therapies, what we know now is just trying to gun for the way we think, and changing that is not actually always going to be as successful as we'd like. So what you've got to do is create opportunities for new learning, where they're able to go into places and spaces. And you know, a really good recent example that I've had is someone who's got a fear of going into supermarkets. Now, they would go into the supermarket. I mean, this is a slightly older person, but you know, they would absolutely they would like grab the trolley and they'd like run in like this, you know. And so their fear was, everyone in the supermarket's going to laugh at me, and they're going to look at my trolley and they're going to be like, why are you buying that wine? That was literally what she believed was going to happen. So what we had to do is work together on a plan to do 2 things, not just get her back in the supermarket, but she needed to look up Why? Yeah, she needed to actually see that those people in the supermarket were actually just going about their own business, right? And so it's interesting because when you have young people who have a fear of public speaking or a fear of being in places with lots of people, you'll tend to find they'll look down a lot. So what you need to do is think about how do you get them to look up? How do you get them to actually see whether what they think is going to come true actually does come true? And so whilst that's very difficult to do, and it might be that they're busy breathing as they're walking their trolley or whatever it might be, but this is some of what you want to encourage from quite an early age actually, is check out what other people are doing, look at their faces, does their expression, are they going, you're a loser? Like, can you see that on their face? Because actually there's a lot of mind reading that happens with young people, like they just guess all the time about what other people are thinking. Sometimes it's true, in fact, people do say mean things, but sometimes it's not. So this cycle of avoidance we talked a little bit about before is really important, both for you as parents to think about how you act at times when your child's avoiding something. Because sometimes what happens is that we kind of are involved in this bit here, where what tends to happen is that our young person wants to avoid a situation, and sometimes because it's so difficult for us to actually get them to go, we go, okay, just don't go. And sometimes we end up in this sort of path of least resistance way of dealing with things. And we all know that there's good reason for that. That's not that you're a terrible parent. And it's understandable that you don't want your child dealing with the level of distress they are. But the downside to that is what happens is that the more they avoid, they feel better in the meantime, like, oh, I don't have to go to school today. They take a breath and, relax. But the problem is you've got Tuesday morning and then you've got Wednesday morning, and, so you get into this kind of pattern. And so as parents, we just have to be really mindful of, like, are there times when we're also allowing them to avoid? Now, I think it's a balancing act, because there's certainly times where actually we go, you know what, it's okay today to not do whatever that thing might be. But what happens very quickly, and some of you will know, is that patterns happen super quick, and before you know it, they're off school or they've given up dancing, or, like they're sort of out of the pattern of actually doing the thing they're afraid of doing. So this slide's kind of like a tip your hat really, and we'll move to strategies now, is about, when do you actually need to get extra help? When do you need to go and talk to the school nurse? When do you need to go and talk to your doctor? I mean, one of the cool things at the moment is that there are lots of different, starting to be a lot more offering in what we call the primary mental health space. So rather than in community mental health and services that provide support for people at a higher end of need, that there's starting to be quite a lot of thought by the government to really think about how do we support our young people. And so one of the things to do is to always go to your GP, because there's lots of access now, often with your GPs, to get sort of up to 6 sessions to support. But often as a parent, it's like, how do I know when to do that? And so when you do it is when you start to notice that the anxiety is a bit like an octopus and it's got tentacles. So basically when you start to notice it impacting all these different areas of their life. And so you might see them not sleeping so well, or starting to stop going to different places. They don't participate in activities as much. Their mood might be lower than normal. Struggle to deal with the physical stuff. So what you might start to see is maybe experiences of panic, like breathlessness, I'm having a heart attack, I can't breathe. Now there's a difference between intense anxiety symptoms and actually panic attacks. So panic attacks in and of themselves is a really intense kind of experience of panic, where genuinely often the experience is, I'm going to die. There's something really bad is going on, my heart's going to stop. And so panic in and of itself is something that actually, the fear of having a panic attack can actually begin a panic attack, if that makes sense. And so sometimes people talk about, I'm having a panic attack. It may not always be a full kind of clinical panic attack, but what you might see is a real kind of panic response. And so the other thing is when you start to see a pattern of anxiety that really is out of proportion to what is normal in that young person's life. Now, many of us will have young people who are neurodiverse. I have a young person who's neurodiverse, who struggles with change, he finds change difficult. He's terrified. He's got to go to college next year. He's just like, he's been, in Clevedon school, jollied along in a little school, and now he's like turning 13 and he's got to go to high school. He's totally afraid of going. And it makes sense to me, because navigating that world for him is going to be really challenging. And so his fear in some ways does make sense, and it is going to be hard for him. And so super sensors will have times in their life where they're going to come across places and spaces where they are actually going to have an increased level of anxiety for a period of time. So what we want to do is, when we're thinking about this, this is more about, with your young people who are particularly teenagers, who are into that stage of needing to get credits and what have you. We want them to have a positive level or experience of stress. So we don't want them to have no stress. So we want them to have a level of expected, predictable stress when it comes to kind of deadlines and exam stress and things like that. And it's a fine line towards kind of supporting young people to experience it versus it being too much. All right. So we're going to talk about this. Are you doing this slide or me? Can't remember. Oh no, I'll do this one quickly and then you jump in. So we've tipped our hat already to starting to think about what are some of the different ways of us being able to manage anxiety. So one of the things is exposure, creating new opportunities for learning, like we talked about with the supermarket lady. One is we've got to check the facts of a situation and try to go, okay, how does it make sense that this is true or not true, or your reaction, how does it make sense? We find alternative ways to view thoughts, which we're going to talk about soon. In the next session, we're going to spend a lot more time, even though it's in November, on mindfulness and radical acceptance, like how to accept things in our life that we can't change. It's quite a big topic. We just didn't have time to kind of pull it in today. But actually tolerating and accepting things in our life we can't change, or very difficult things that are painful, is in and of itself a set of skills. And then postponing your worry. So the only thing I want to talk about with mindfulness today, and we're going to spend a lot more time on it next time, is about really the mindfulness is talked about a lot, but I'm telling you what, there's a lot of good evidence that really shows that the more mindful you are and the more present you are in this moment, right now my tummy is hurting, it's angry, like the more mindful you are of actually your experience right now, and the more aware you are of that person's facial expression and what that person just said, the more you're able to then be able to kind of figure out, what am I feeling, what's actually going on right now, and then what do I need to do about it. And so mindfulness in many different places and spaces, whether it be the workplace or school or what have you, is really a set of skills that I think is super valuable to really think about. And it's not that you have to sit in a Buddha pose and practice like long periods of mindfulness. It's actually how do you bring it into your everyday life. And so we're going to talk a lot more about that in the next session. I've just been to Rarotonga. This is my picture.
Just been to Rarotonga.
It actually rained.
I don't
about
have
the
a
whole
picture.
time. But that was the one day that it was like sunny.
Awesome. So relaxation. There are some old, tried and true relaxation techniques, and I guess relaxation techniques are this thing that we've been talking about with our body, managing our physiological response. The tried and true ones, and actually whenever someone comes to therapy, I always ask them, have you done something like this before? They'll invariably, well, sometimes they'll say yes. And then my next question is, what was most helpful for you? And often it's the breathing. So breathing exercises and managing our breathing, which I'm going to spend a bit more time on. Really important, really useful. Progressive muscle relaxation. Is anyone familiar with that? Yeah, there's heaps on the internet, there's heaps of guided things, there's heaps of apps, and there's heaps of youth-friendly apps as well, which are really good for looking at. That's all I'm going to say about that. But I want to talk a bit more about breathing. I often hear, and I don't know if you've heard your young people say, that their heart rate is feeling erratic, it's a bit jumpy. And it's interesting to think about that. That often happens when our parasympathetic nervous system and our nervous system are not in sync. It's like driving your car with your foot on the gas and the brake at the same time. It's going to make for a real jerky ride. It's not going to be very efficient, and it's going to probably be quite hard on the vehicle. And that is essentially what it's like for us. And so it's super important that we can actually manage and activate our parasympathetic nervous system. I don't know if you know, but when we inhale, our breathing rate is faster than when we exhale. And if you've looked at any breathing exercises, they always talk about a longer exhale. Often with young people who are particularly anxious, I will even just tell them to focus on their exhale, because you're always going to inhale. And if we can focus on our exhale, we have a lot more chance of slowing it down. I wonder if you'd just do something with me. Actually, let me move on. This one here. We're just going to do something together. Just move for a moment. And I wonder if you could place one hand on your chest, and one hand on your stomach. And I just want you, just for a moment, to breathe. Just notice your breathing. I want you to notice which hand is moving the most. I want you to notice if you're breathing through your nose or your mouth. Notice what your shoulders are doing. And you can drop your hands. I'm wondering if you'd be brave enough to let me know if you think that you are a belly breather, if your belly moved most. Yeah. If you think you might be a chest breather in this moment. Yeah. I guess the most efficient muscles for breathing are our diaphragm. And what tends to happen when we're a bit anxious or stressed, we tend to breathe shallower, and we tend to use a lot more of our auxiliary muscles for breathing, which is less efficient and very tiring for us. And it's always just a really good check for us and for our young people. Hands on belly and chest. Notice what we're doing. Even the stopping, the pausing and noticing can help us to slow down our breathing. Has anyone used any apps for breathing? Does anyone know of any? Yeah, does anyone want to call any apps out? Calm, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there certainly are quite a few out there. Oh, you want to talk about the vagal nerve?
You carry on and I'll go back.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so there definitely is evidence that breathing works, that paced breathing works. I think I mentioned it before. The thing about breathing and any of these relaxation techniques, they are way more effective if we practice them when we're not stressed, if we actually make them a practice in our life. Either set an alarm or pair them with an activity that we're doing frequently and actually notice our breathing and take control of our breathing. Anxiety would tell us that we're out of control. And one thing that's important when we're anxious is to find ways to be back in control. Taking control of our breathing is a really good thing to do. Another thing that anxiety does is absolutely takes our focus, like we talked about before. And so if we can change our focus and pull our focus to the simple act of breathing, it can help to reduce our anxiety. Another technique that we talk about a lot, or a concept that we think about a lot, is anchoring. Again, anxiety has us in our thoughts, and often when people are anxious, their thoughts can feel fast and out of control. I recently met a young person who said that going to school was just so anxiety provoking for them, and they said it was because of the walking through school at lunchtime and the argy-bargy, the jostling and the barging, and the fact that they may actually get bumped and pushed in the hallways and the corridors. And so what they had done was they had developed a different route of getting to classes, maybe got there a bit late, I don't know, or moved a bit faster, which would seem like a great way to solve a problem. Don't have to go through the argy-bargy anymore. But actually what that did is they didn't find a way to tolerate the anxiety and the busyness around school. And essentially, I guess Kirsten's just talked about avoidance. What that's done for that young person has generalised their anxiety to other spaces and places where there's lots of people. Going to the mall at Botany, no longer go with their friends, getting on a bus, some cafes. And so we can see what anxiety does. Like that octopus, it finds its way into other areas of our life because we haven't either found a way to tolerate it or noticed that it's actually not as bad as we predicted it might have been. Mutton birds sing a song, Anchor Me, one of my favourites. Shivering skin where the green waves crash and the whirlpools spin, anchor me. And I think sometimes anxiety or difficult emotions can feel like that, can feel like you're in a whirlpool. They can feel like a storm, and in the middle of a storm, sometimes the best thing is to batten down the hatches and to put an anchor down and to kind of wait it out. And so we need to find a way to anchor ourselves in emotional storms. We talked about social anxiety. Social anxiety is interesting. It's fueled, I think we said, by the fear of judgment by others. But the other thing is it brings our full attention to ourself as an emotional being, as a social being. So we pay full attention to how we're coming across, how we sound, how other people are perceiving us, the feedback we're getting from other people, and that's all we notice when social anxiety is big. If you ask someone who's been socially anxious, and by the way, young people tend to call it socially awkward, if you ask someone who's been in a situation who's been socially anxious, you ask them what other people were wearing, they often can't tell you. Or you ask them what was on the walls in that restaurant, they often can't tell you because their focus has been very much inward and on all the thoughts to do with social anxiety. And so anchoring is about bringing ourselves out of that and anchoring ourselves in the here and now. Expanding our awareness of what is here in this present moment and taking control over our physical actions. So I wonder if you could just try one more thing with me and then I'll hand it over to Kirsten. As you're sitting there, just check in with yourself for a moment what emotion you're feeling. And then I want you just to put your fingers together like this, hands together, and actually apply a bit of pressure so that you can feel the tension up your arms. And actually, without having someone stretch, maybe move around a little bit. Stamp your feet, make some noise. Okay. Just check in with yourself about your emotion for a moment. Did anyone notice a change in how they felt? Hands up, anyone? My friends could put their hands up now. Possibly that would be more effective if you were feeling a high emotion before we started. But I'm hoping that maybe you saw how that can be helpful when someone has high emotion, particularly anxiety, to actually pull them away from what's happening in their head and the whirlwind of emotion and actually take some control of their body. And with big emotion, we would need to do something a lot bigger than stamp our feet. We might need to take them for a walk around the block, charge around, or do something a lot bigger. But these are very helpful in the moment things that we can do. And I recommend practicing them when emotion's not high, so they are more useful when emotion is high.
So we need some willing participants. I'll let you in a little bit into what we're going to do in a second. So I do a lot of work in the places and spaces around emotion and emotion dysregulation. And one of the things that we know is that we all have a vagal nerve in our body, one of the largest nerves in the body. Now, if you stimulate the vagal nerve through a couple of different ways, one is vagal nerve posing, yoga posing, which I won't do, but it's very effective, where you lie down, you put a pillow in between your shoulders, and you put your feet at 90-degree angle up against the wall, and what you do is you open your chest cavity up and then you just breathe. It's actually a great one. I do it with my daughter on her bed sometimes when she's struggling to get to sleep at night time. We'll both lie on the bed and we'll have our feet up on the wall and actually have a pillow under our shoulders, and we'll just breathe and chat. So what you want to do is you're essentially trying to stimulate the vagal nerve, because what happens if you stimulate the vagal nerve, essentially what it does is it activates that parasympathetic nervous system. So there's a couple of ways that you can do this, like vagal nerve posing yoga. You can Google it and you'll find how to do it. The other is deep, slow breaths. And so the key thing about the paced breathing, the thing with breathing is you have to train a relaxation response. You cannot go to your child, I want you to breathe, when they're in the middle of an anxiety attack. And they're going to calm down. You have to train the response. So really what you should be doing, and what I've done a lot with Milan, is actually repeatedly practice on a regular basis every night, paced breathing. Breathing in 4, hold for a couple of seconds, and breathing out 6. You're training that kind of, as you're stretching that breath out. Now there's a few nice ways that you can do this if you've got children who do struggle. You can get ping pong balls and blow them with straw across the table to practice that kind of long out breath. I mean, actually speech therapists are like gurus at this stuff. My son took at least 5 years before he really could start talking. And so they did a lot of speech and breath work with him. And actually it was some of the best stuff. So like breathing out in a straw into a glass of water, training that breath, like just really long breath out. So what I encourage you all to do, and this is regardless of whether your young people like feel quite anxious, that we all could do with this. I practice paced breathing all the time. On my way to work in the morning, when I'm standing up here about to speak to you all, but the thing is, it's not something that you have to do intentionally, like lying down and doing a full breathing exercise. You want to find a way to teach your young people how to do a very simple breathing exercise that they can just weave into their everyday life. We all need it. And so I think that's the thing I want to stress about the kind of relaxation breathing. So the next thing we're going to do is something which is a very important skill that I do a lot. Particularly I work a lot with young people who have a lot of behaviour, including suicidal urges, self-harm urges and actions. And so what we've got to do is we've basically got to put a roadblock between them actually acting on, having the urge and acting on it. The other thing to think about is how do we, when you're at a high level of stress and emotion, the reality is that most of the time skillful ways of dealing with it don't show up in our heads. We're just, like you're in that kind of stress mode. So what you want to do sometimes when we think about skills to manage emotions, there's the skills that you need when you're like 70 to 100% overwhelmed. So you've got to do that first before you then get to a reduced level of emotion to then figure out how to solve the problem. And so this acute cold exposure is one way to do this. Now, I know you're all not going to have necessarily bowls of cold water lying around, but there's a couple of ways I'm going to show you how to do this, and it is one of the most effective ways. It essentially simulates the dive response, which when you think about mammals or you think about free divers, when they dive into really cold water, you just go, like your whole body just goes. And so I want 5 willing participants, 2 who are willing to dunk their face in ice cold water. Do not come up if you have a heart problem, an eating disorder, like we need everyone to get out of here in one piece. So I want 2 people who are willing to put their face in ice cold water, and then I've got 3 cold masks that I'm going to get other people to do. So those that are going to do the ice cold water, We're going to get our emotion up a little bit. You're going to lean over and you're just going to hold your breath as long as you can. And then come out. And if you feel like you've kind of calmed down to a degree that you're kind of happy with, you just stay there, or you might dunk your face again. It's all right. No pressure. So those who are going to use the cold mask, so this might be more up your alley. So I just been at Kmart buying some of these, by the way. So they're kind of freely available. You can buy them in pharmacies and Kmart. You keep them in the fridge. The next best thing is a bag of cold peas or a cold flannel and a Ziploc bag in your fridge, not the freezer, because you'll freeze their face off. So the next best thing is to wrap a cold mask around their face. Really what you're trying to do, ultimately you kind of want those like scary, like big full gel face masks, like the scary movie masks. But I can't find them. They'll be on AliExpress or something. But what you want to do is try and get this part of your face cool, ideally this part too. So bags of peas do actually work quite well. So what you can do, even if you leave today, is kind of find a mask somewhere. So I keep one in my fridge all of the time. It's very effective, just to put the mask on your face, to sit down. Whoever does it, I want you to sit down and I want you to lean forward. And then you take a big deep breath in and you hold your breath for as long as you can, and then you slowly breathe out. And you might do that a couple of times. So any willing participants, not just my mates in the audience, who wants to give it a go? What? Oh, you're busy nominating people. Oh. All right, who have we got? We need 2 for cold water, and then we need 3, hopefully 3 people. Okay, fabulous. Come up here. All right, who else? I think you might need to come too. Come on then. I'm just going to clear some space so that you can sit. Oh, yep. Oh, one of my mates coming up. That's good, good, good. Okay. All right. So, what I need to do...
Actually, these masks.
These masks, yeah.
So we can just get them from that Kmart.
You can. But in fact, because you've come up here, you can have it. It's yours.
Shut the front door.
Yep.
That's amazing.
It's all about the free stuff. Okay, so there's 3 masks here. I have got another one to give, whoever's going to do it. So I would encourage you guys in the audience, sounds like a game show, if you want to have a go at doing something, we're going to do something now first, all of us together. I've done this quite a lot with John in different situations and spaces and evenings where we've had social occasions. So what I would encourage you to do is if you want to boogie along, do it. Don't be too shy. No, do whatever you need to do. And then practice the pace breathing. So you might not have something cold to put on your face, but you might do a bit of a boogie. You can stand up if you want. And then when you sit down, I want you all then to just kind of do your pace breathing. So in 4 and out 6. Okay, so now I've kind of let you guys in a little bit into what I'm going to get you to do. So I want you to like come over here, and we've got our lovely guys up here who are going to get the show started. Take it away, DJ. We're not looking at... Oh, come on, quick, let's go. It's got to be kind of loud, you know.
It goes electric wavy when I turn it on. Off from my city,
We're dancing.
off from my home. We're flying up, no ceiling when we in our zone. I got that sunshine in my pocket, got that good soul in my feet. I feel that hot blood in my body when it drops. Ooh, I can't take my eyes off it. Moving so phenomenally. Come on, like the way we rock it. So don't stop. And under the lights,
Oh, got a few of you. Got at least get me forward. Come on,
nowhere to
Trista.
hide when I'm getting
Come on, girls.
close. When we move,
Okay, now you're all going to move forward right up here.
so just imagine, just imagine. Nothing I can see but you when you dance, dance, dance. Feel good, good creeping up on you, so just dance,
you guys, two of you.
I picked that up.
Yep, I want you to pop your face in that nice cold water for as long as you can. You guys sit down here.
Yeah, that's that guy.
Yeah, you have that one. What's that?
Do I get a snorkel?
A snorkel. So I want you to sit there. So place it on your face, the gel side.
The gel side.
Wrap it around. Yep. Yep. Yeah, 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 you're good. Awesome. You guys go. Yep. Yep, hold your face in as long as you can. If you can. Yep. You guys lean forward.
Oh, yeah.
Breathe in really deeply. Hold your breath for as long as you can. And then slowly breathe out. And do it 3 or 4 times.
Do I have to do it again now?
One more time. And then when you're ready, you can come out. All right. That looks amazing. You can take it off. Okay. All right. So I want to hear from you guys what your experience was. Now, by the way, this is not, we don't have an expected outcome. It's just, we're just interested in what these guys noticed. Oh, hang on a minute. Is that going to work? Good? Awesome. Okay, so what did you notice before and after?
The water?
Yeah, before the water and after. So before in terms of like just how you were feeling physiologically, before and then once you put your face in.
I suppose, yeah, fairly anxious, I suppose, as you call it. Normally dancing up in front of all these people tonight. And then I suppose once your face goes in the water, I'm just concentrated on holding my breath and being in the water. So focused on that and not thinking about anything else.
So do you
Not
feel
drowning.
as anxious now as
No.
you did before? No.
Not that, yeah.
Okay. Well, apart from now that I'm making you speak, you know, go back up again. Put it back in the water.
Oh yeah, I suppose it's as a grown adult, you don't get up normally and dance in front of people anymore. So yeah, you do feel that anxious and you feel yourself getting a little bit hot. Put yourself in the water and it does, yeah, it cools you off. You literally feel yourself come out of it.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Did you notice a change in your heart rate?
Wasn't thinking that hard.
Not
on
thinking that
right
hard,
now.
yeah. So what you often tend to notice, I mean, I just kind of threw you guys in, but what people tend to notice is that physiologically your heart rate will shift. So you'll notice going from kind of the racing and even feeling quite hot, obviously it's cold water, but that you'll notice a shift. So what about you guys? What do you notice?
I was feeling super awkward, but quite okay, but awkward, and then just calm once because it was just dark and just breathing and yeah, to just slow down
Yeah,
and nice and cool.
yeah.
Yeah, I felt quite hot and I could feel my heart rate because that was out of my comfort zone.
Sorry about that.
And
sorry,
then-
not sorry.
No, it's fine. It was good. And then as soon as I put the cool mask on, I was in my own zone and I really could feel myself breathing. And I slowed my breathing down and my whole face really cooled down.
Yeah,
So really effective.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly the same as everyone else. Yeah, just was really a bit awkward for me dancing in front
Yeah.
of everyone, and then just noticed my breathing, and then my heart rate started to drop as well. So yeah,
Yeah.
It actually worked. It was good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. Now some people do go, that didn't work. That was shit. That does happen sometimes, by the way, especially when you work with teenagers. But anyway, amazing, you guys. Thank you so much. Round of applause. You can keep your mask. You can keep it. Yep. All right. Now that we've all danced. Okay. So before we move on, I want you all to reach under your chairs and see if you can find something. If you've got a yellow ticket, come up here. I'm not going to make you dance, I promise. Okay, so a couple of things. All right. I can choose off. All right, so you guys get to choose something off the table. So let me tell you quickly. A couple of these books that I've got here that we're giving away tonight. So these are from a lady in Australia. She's awesome. It's called Hey Warrior and Hey Awesome. The website's Hey Sigmund. They're awesome books for our young ones that actually, even up to a reasonable age, to really kind of get a sense of just that anxiety is normal, how it makes sense. So some of the pictures we've got in here are from here. So it's a great website. So those are a couple of things that we're just giving away to people. The other is this book called Letters to You. I don't know if many of you in the room here know Jazz Thornton. She's a mental health advocate. She won Young New Zealander of the Year and more recently Dancing with the Stars. So she is... Yeah. So this book's really quite something, partly because I wrote a little bit in it, but not because my name's on the thing. The reason I say it is something. So she's someone who has had quite a significant journey in her life. Much of her teenage years really struggled, was in and out of inpatient units. Someone during that time wrote her a few letters. And what she did is that she gave her these letters and said, open this when you're lonely, open this when you're sad, open this when you're suicidal. So this book essentially is a bunch of letters, which is written for our young people. I mean, Kylie and my daughter have even been busy reading it. Letters for when you're lonely, when you're guilty, when you're sad. There's a letter from your therapist. And what's quite cool about it is that the letters are all through there and are aimed at your young people and a resource for them to pick up and read whenever they feel like they need to read it. And then what's threaded through there, which is my part of it, is all the psychological tips and ways of actually dealing with it. So some of the things we're talking about with you today are some of the things that are written in the book. So it's an amazing resource. If any of you are interested in sponsoring any for the local schools, let me know. We're Progressive and a bunch of people have been really generous in sponsoring some of the books to put into the local schools. So if anyone's interested in doing that, let me know. But aside from that, we've got them there so that people can have them as a resource. So I hope you guys enjoy it, the ones who got a couple of those books today. But that's awesome. Okay, no more free stuff. Right, where are we up to? So we've talked a bit about this. We're nearly done. I'm going the wrong way. So we've done a lot of focus on the physiological side of anxiety, right? How do we regulate the physiology of anxiety? Our experience of it, whether it's through movement, whether it's through breath and relaxation, whether it's through some sensory kind of experiences. We know that there's fidget toys and all sorts of other ways of regulating emotion. But one of the things we'll talk a lot more about next time is about how to accept the things that you can't control and the things that are outside of your control. And this is, I think, very relevant for a lot of us in this day and age. But really what this sort of focuses on is how do you move your young people in a direction where they focus more on the things that they can control and influence rather than the things they can't. You cannot have every single teacher be amazing. Every single, it's one of those things where you'll get a mixture of experiences with different people. So how do you get them to focus on what they can manage and control? And so we want them to be listening to their body. I mean, I put caffeine in for you guys, not necessarily for your young people, but your teenagers, right? I mean, how many times do I see teenagers with a pie and a monster walking down the road? And some of you too, maybe. That actually one of the things that we've got to think about is when you struggle on a daily basis with anxiety, what happens is that rather than sitting at a 0 where you kind of just chill and kind of dealing with the world, you're sitting at like a 40 or a 50. Now what happens is that when you're sitting at a level of anxiety, and sometimes that's influenced by our histories, if we've got a trauma history, for example, that if you then go and have a monster, probably not going to help so much with your heart rate. So what happens is things in our environment elevate the physical symptoms of anxiety actually and make it worse. And so listening to their bodies and listening to what they need and teaching them to do that. Do they need to get outside and exercise? Do they need to just sit quietly? Do they need some time out? Do they need to be alone? Do they need to be connected and social? And so it really is thinking about how do we encourage them to be mindful of what they need in that moment in time, because what we think they need might not be what they need. You know, I'm one of those mums who's a bit more like, okay, let's do this and that. Actually, it's just like, you know, they just need some time. And so the last sort of bunch of things we're going to just very briefly talk about is how do we shift our thinking? Now, we have already spent a bit of time talking about this today, and one of the things we know about one of the most world research therapies, which is cognitive behaviour therapy, is that if we can find a way to observe our thoughts, notice what happens as they come in and leave our heads, that we can then maybe start to challenge them and ask questions around whether they are based in fact or not. And so, you know, what's interesting, and as you grow, I talked about growing our little humans, as we grow our young humans, inevitably as a parent, what you're trying to do is help, I guess, intervene a little bit in how they interpret situations. Now, this guy here, obviously, some of us think a bird pooping on a head's good luck. It could be taken in two different ways. You know, some people might be like, oh, I'm going to win lotto, and other people might be like, oh, my day's over. And so how we interpret exactly the same event definitely impacts how we feel and how we feel in our bodies and that kind of whole sort of cycle of experience. And so what we need to do is start to really understand with our young people what are the patterns of thoughts that they're having. Do they tend to think a lot that the worst is going to happen? Do they have lots of judgmental thoughts or negative thoughts about themselves and the world and other people? And then how do we move them in a direction where we get them to very gently start to challenge the way that they think? Maybe that's not always true, you know. How do we see this in a different way? Now, we've talked a bit about some of these things, but really what we want to do is focus here, is like some of these questions are great. What evidence is there that this thought may not always be true? Have you had other experiences where people haven't done this or said this? Is there another way that you could look at this? Will it matter in a few hours, a week, or 2 weeks? That's my favourite. And usually the answer is, it matters forever. Doesn't always land. If the worst did happen, how would you cope with that? Now, one of the very interesting things that we tend to do as a species is we tend to go, oh no, I don't want that to happen. But we don't think beyond that and go, okay, if it does happen, what are we going to do about it? And I think we need to do that more, particularly with our young people. Things don't always work out. Things don't go well sometimes. You know, with my son and all the challenges he's got, he's got gross motor challenges. So cross country for him is like a nightmare. And he always comes last, right? And so for him, I'm not going to have him be sick on that day or anything like that. What I've got to do is overcome and find a way to help him deal with what he thinks is the worst disaster of the world, which is coming last in cross country. Well, in fact, it's a reality, you know, for him. And in his life, he's going to have a lot of situations actually where things are really super hard for him. So how do I get him to think beyond that and go, okay, how will you cope if you come last? What are you going to do? You know, how are you going to celebrate the fact that you actually finished? You know, how do we shift their focus? You know, let's say they fail their maths test. It's likely that that will happen, actually. You know, how do we get them to go, if you do fail, what are you going to do? How are we going to deal with that? You failing a math test doesn't mean you're a failure, but it means you failed your math test. You know, how do you get them to just see what the facts are? What would you say to a friend? Emotions always pass. How can you ride the wave? And so this is that reality of the fact that sometimes we go through hard times. So we've got to find a way to ride through that. It's not about stopping it and fixing it right away. Do you fear that if you accept it, it won't go away? You know, I think this is not necessarily something that you would do with perhaps younger people, but as you get into adolescence, if they accept the fact that, you know, they're not going to be top of the class in maths, you know, is that a problem or not? And often people will talk about radical acceptance next time as a skill, but when big things in people's lives happen that they wish never happened, sometimes we have to work to accept that it happened. And people's fear is that if you accept something, you're okay with it, or it's going to be that you agree with it. So So there's so many different ways, I think, and I think, particularly this bottom one is, we talked about logical, rational thinking before, but, what are the advantages and disadvantages of focusing right now on how bad you feel? Now, a lot of young people do identify with feeling sad, for example. Their identity gets wrapped up in their mood and their anxiety. And so sometimes it's about validating their experience, but going, actually, what would it be like for you if you weren't sad anymore? And some people were like, that's all I've ever known. One of the hardest things sometimes when I work with young people is that much of their life, their experience in life, they've often struggled. So they can't see a time when things are going to be better yet. So we will have to kind of shift them and move them through that space. And teenage years are super difficult. All right, last 2 slides and then we're done. You're up, Leigh.
Okay, so this is something we often do and really effective, and we've just talked about getting our young people to notice what they're thinking. That can be really hard when our thoughts are moving really fast. And so I'm a huge fan of writing. I'm a huge fan of, call it journaling, call it just brain dumping, but just getting used to writing down thoughts and standing back and noticing what the thoughts are. Just tip 1. Tip 2, we do this thing called postpone your worry. People will often describe themselves as warriors, and they'll talk about how, particularly when there's a space in their day, they're not listening to music or scrolling on social media or listening to a podcast, that actually their mind is going busy and they can't stop it. And one way that can be helpful is to actually schedule a time to worry. Might want to make it 10 minutes, 20 minutes, I'm not sure, whatever, but actually almost like honour the worry, and actually spend some time writing down what the worries are. Take that 10 minutes, worry as hard as you can worry. Tell your young person, this is it, just worry like a warrior, just worry like a champion, and just get all of those worries down. Really effective, because we've actually gone, okay, brain, I'm taking you seriously here. Mind, you've given me all these worries, I'm actually paying attention. Because sometimes what worry is our brain trying to problem solve and work something out. And if we don't stop and go, hold on, is there a problem I need to solve here? It'll continue to come back. Sometimes worry is not a problem that we need to solve, but it's just a habit that we may have developed of overthinking. And actually this, by writing it down, scheduling a time, and then closing the book, solving any problems that need to be solved, or planning to solve them at another time, and then closing the book. Later on, when our mind goes back to worrying, we can remind ourselves that, no, I've done my worrying for the day. There'll be another chance to worry, and consider that tomorrow. I don't know how that's coming across. It sounds a bit simplistic as I hear it back, but it's actually a really effective strategy for a lot of people. Did you want to say something about that? Positive thoughts. Obviously, with anxiety, we have a lot more negative thoughts. Our thoughts with anxiety tend to be in the future. We tend to be predicting poor outcomes, and we tend to be predicting our inability to cope with the outcome. So this is about intentionally shifting our focus on positive thoughts. Sometimes our young people need a lot of help to shift from worry thoughts to positive thoughts. And that can be where we can come in, doing some of those things that Kirsten has said, asking some of those questions, and finding different perspectives and different ways to frame things that are more helpful and more positive. With anxiety, we will tend to notice and be quite tunnel visioned about what can go wrong in a situation. And actually, one thing, I often have people around speech time in the room, and we're often talking about the judgments that they're going to get from people. And what we often do is a pie chart, and we actually go, okay, what are all the things that 16-year-olds think about? They think about their friends, they think about themselves, they think about how they look, they think about the weekend, they think about what they've got to do. I want to get a job, I want to make money, I want to get more buff. I've got a crush, what's happening on social media. And then how much of that is left for them actually thinking about you? And it's often a really useful thing for young people to realise that, other people actually don't think about me that much. And there's a whole other perspective I could be taking here rather than, they're all going to be thinking about me. And it can be like that in a lot of situations where our focus can be very narrowed on the bit that could go wrong, and yet there's a whole lot of other stuff that could go right or has gone right. We did a talk, we went through all the classrooms in Cockle Bay, so that's why it's kind of child friendly, and we spoke to every single class and we came up with cheerleading statements. The children came up with them, and you can imagine the cheerleading statements for the 5-year-olds were quite different to the 10-year-olds. But I think this can be really helpful as well, just recognising that you have yourself, and it's that whole inner critic thing or the inner cheerleader, and actually really intentionally focusing on that inner cheerleader and that person who is actually on your side, and that person who's got some really helpful statements that are actually going to spur you on and pull you away from the anxiety and actually move you toward that life that you want to live, move you toward those things that you want to be doing. But I think, again, we need to be intentional about role modelling cheerleader, encouraging type statements, and also enabling our young person, helping them to develop them for themselves so that they can own them and be their own cheerleader.
All right. Ta-da! We're done.
That's all our top tips for the night.
So it would be, given that we've done lots of talking already, we'd like to give you the opportunity to ask questions, but I would just like to close our piece of the evening with a karakia before we move to questions. All right, inoi tātou, whakatauha kia tauha, whakataurangi kia taurangi, whakatau kupu kia tau kupu, humie huie tai kia. All right, questions? Does anyone have any questions, comments, thoughts before we finish up? There doesn't have to be, by the way. Hey? Do you have one thing that you would like to ask?
No, I've got two kids that are both different spaces. They're both quite sensory in different ways, and it's one goes to a play therapist, one needs to go to a psychologist or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. The purpose of this evening is to empower you guys as parents, because in a sense you're the experts on your children. It's all well and good, they roll into our office and, what are you going to do for me today, Kirsten? Someone said to me this week. I was like, oh, well. But I think the reality is what we need to do more of is actually enable you guys to have the skills to be able to know what to do, because a lot of what we do in the therapy room, yes, it is clinical, it's thought through, it's informed by therapies, but actually at the end of the day, it's a lot of what we do, what I'm talking to you about here. And so we don't always have the resources to rock up and go and see a therapist. That's not our reality sometimes. Sometimes therapy is not necessarily the solution. With our neurodiverse children, they're going to walk every day of their lives actually struggling with anxiety. There might be moments in time where they might need a bit of therapy, but actually they might not. What they need is a support network and people around them that love and care for them. And most of the people that know my kids who are at camping or everything like that, they know Zave, they know what to do to support them, they move them along. The community kind of knows what's needed sometimes. And so... I think
it's just having the tools to know what this is very helpful.
Yeah.
And it's getting more in-depth tools.
Yeah. That's right, yeah.
I've learned with my daughter's play therapist.
Yeah.
I've got the steps that I need.
Yeah.
Added stuff.
Yeah. I mean, part of our hope is to figure out different types of things that the community needs in terms of some of the topics and stuff, which we might be able to present a little bit more. Yeah.
How much can they potentially grow out of versus needing help with? Like my daughter's just about 10 and still struggles to go to sleep by herself, still wakes in the night.
Yeah.
Quite a bit of separation anxiety. But I always sort of thought, she's not still going to come and cuddle up to me when she's 16.
Yes, this is likely. Yeah, look, I think there's developmental ages and stages, do you know? And I think so that's why it's like we want to somehow not we want to normalize anxiety to some degree, but you've got to think about at what point is it not shifting or changing, you know? So you might get to a certain age, maybe 10 or 11 or 12, where you go, actually, by now, probably it would make sense that you would actually be able to find a way to get yourself to sleep or what have you. And so I do think developmentally, I mean, we all know this, you gain more insight as you grow, right? So you become more aware of your world and actually, so I think separation anxiety is a challenging one really, and you've got to find ways to grow their experiences being away from you in their life, which they get anyway as they become more independent, right, as they get to intermediate. So it's trying to find ways to build their confidence, you know, so that then at home they don't need you so much. But there will be a point at which you go, actually, this is really affecting them. That would be then, I would say at that point, go to your GP and have chat or, you know, and just say, what else could we be doing? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
As a father, sometimes I feel that maybe I'm adding to the issue rather than helping this. So how do you recognise that mum's the strong one and I'm the one who's probably helicoptering a bit?
Oh, yeah.
How do I recognise, hey, pull back because you're not helping them?
Have you noticed today as we've been chatting some helicopter behaviours that you do? Yeah. So that's the first step, like just noticing it. And actually in that moment in time where you want to move in and protect and do all the things that you want to do, you might just go, actually, I need to lean back. You know, I need to lean out. Actually, they need to experience a bit of discomfort and build confidence in whatever it is that they need to do.
And it's just recognising that sometimes I feel that my kid is like, mate, I don't actually need you.
Yeah.
Son, sorry.
Yeah, so how do you decide actually when you're needed to be there versus when you, yeah. So I think what you want to think about too a little bit is like, where do I want them to get to? You know, like how do you grow their independence and how do you grow their ability to cope with situations? And then it's like you're sort of scaffolding them along to get there. And so I think that's the challenge, isn't it? In that moment in time, do I move in or do I stand back? And so I don't think there's a straight answer to it. Maybe if you came and had a chat and we figure out what the thing is that they're doing. But like I think for you, it is about noticing at times, if you really want them to be more independent, as a 10-year-old, what would I be kind of expecting them to be doing? As a 12-year-old, what would I be expecting? So you sort of think like at a developmental age, what would they be doing independently on their own versus with you? So if you've got a 13-year-old, for example, that's saying, or a 14-year-old that's going, don't leave me at home, don't go down the road, when we know actually lots of 14-year-olds, you can go to the dairy and back and leave them at home and it's kind of normalised, that might be something that you go, actually, we need to be building your confidence to be able to be on your own. Yeah. Yeah. I love that you spoke up. Yeah. A couple more questions and then we'll finish up. Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
But then as you gradually build those conversations, build that trust, build the pillars of trust, you sort of get that information. How do you try and get that sooner rather than later? You don't want it to be too late.
Go, Leigh.
What?
Leigh's like,
but how do you sort of get that information at the best possible time?
So here's the thing. You've got to balance up your young person developing the skill to first of all know exactly how they're feeling, and second of all then be able to actually speak it out loud. And I don't think that's a skill that they all have naturally. So the thing that you're doing, which is good, is just constantly validating and encouraging them to speak and giving them the space to speak. So I think it's almost like they're training their muscle to kind of know and talk. It may be that your young person might not be someone who is able to immediately identify at this stage and age where they're at and be able to verbally express how they feel, because actually it's kind of normal that lots of young people don't. So I would say keep doing what you're doing and keep that door open and be able to keep having that opportunity, but also to be able to step away if they go, I don't know, I'm not sure. You know, there's a balance between pushing versus just stepping back and having space. So, yeah. And so I think books are really helpful. Watching Inside Out, looking at video clips, having conversations about what different emotions are, all of those ways are great ways of building emotional literacy so that they then get to know, okay, when you're angry, this is what anger is, da 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 da. When you're sad, this is what sadness is. Because I think sometimes it's the literacy that they don't have. Yeah. So using different resources to do that, I think, is super helpful as well. Yeah, yeah. All right, we have kept you long enough. Thank you so much for your patience in listening this evening. We are part of your community. We're an email away. If you want copies of the slides, just let us know. And we will get them through to you. And also, please email through to us at TP Group. If there's other topics or things that you're quite interested in us chatting about, we've got potentially some topics coming up around LGBTQ, how do you support young people with their sexuality and their identity. So that's one kind of topic area we're looking at. The other might be around suicide and self-harm, and really understanding that as a parent and how to support a young person who's experiencing and doing those behaviours. But please let us know if there's other things that you're interested in. But apart from that, we're actually quite overwhelmed that this many people showed up. We only advertised it like 10 days ago, so it's amazing. And thank you to Howick College, and thanks to the boys up the back for very well navigating all of the music and everything else. And thanks to Leigh, my partner in crime, for being amazing. So thank you.
You were going to do.
I did talk about you, yes.